Welcome, everyone. My name is Felicia Zamora. I'm a poet and a professor of poetry at the University of Cincinnati, and I'll be hosting this conversation series that is through the Department of English at the University of Cincinnati. This conversation series is called Poetry as a Catalyst for Radicalization and Liberation for BIPOC and Marginalized People. Before I introduce my guest today, I am going to click out of a few things and tell you just a brief synopsis about the impetus for this conversation series. Really, these interviews and conversations are searching for a collective exploration of poetry's role in activism and social change from poets who I believe art is directly reflecting such inquiry. And joining us today is my guest, author and professor, Dr. Joshua Bennett. Before we jump into the conversation with Dr. Bennett, let me introduce you to Joshua. Dr. Joshua Bennett is the author of The Sobbing School, released from Penguin in 2016, which was a national poetry series selection and a finalist for the NAACP Image Award. He's also the author of Being Property Once Myself from Harvard University Press in 2020, Ode from Penguin 2020, The Study of Human Life, coming out from Penguin in 2022, and Spoken Word, A Cultural History, which is forthcoming from Knopf. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Society of Fellowships at Harvard University, and recently a 2021 Whiting Award. He is the Mellon Assistant Professor of English at Dartmouth College. Joshua, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Felicia.
Well, but before we start talking about poetry as an art form and how it's connected to social change, I really want to ask how you're doing. How have you been the past year during this pandemic? Because we're still in it.
Of course. Yeah, I've been all right, I guess. Yeah, I've been moving between various states of certain kinds of deep mourning, and ecstatic celebration, right? So right at the top of the pandemic, my wife and I found out that we were having a baby. So that was super exciting. But in the midst of that process, we ran up against various, pandemic protocols. So I wasn't able to go to the ultrasounds in person, for instance, until the very last one. And then he was born the next day, which was incredible.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was really glad I got to go to that one and be present for his birth. Because during that process, being barred at the hospital door, even from being able to spend that time with Pam, I wrote these poems about it, this series of dad poems, which will be out in the Study of Human Life. And some of them were published. One was published on the Academy of American Poets website. And unexpectedly, I just received, letters and emails from people who had likewise not only not been able to go to ultrasounds, but some people were not even able to go to the births of their children.
Oh, wow.
There are people who canceled weddings. And so I found myself as part of this really interesting kind of constellation of people experiencing the alienation of various kind of social distancing measures in ways that we never expected. I sort of dreamed maybe my whole life of what that period would be like. And it was nothing like I'd ever fathomed. And I think during the same time, this past March, or right before this past March, my grandmother died, and had to go to her funeral via Zoom. Yeah. And Facebook Live, because the Zoom link failed. And so there have been all these different moments, I think, during the past year plus now, where I've had to think about what forms of social life can survive that kind of widespread catastrophe, right? And not just the catastrophe of COVID-19, but of course these sort of very public spectacles of police killing people, right? And of vigilantes killing people too, right? Lest we forget that Ahmaud Arbery was killed by people who lived near him. And so, yeah, somehow in the midst of all that, I've become a parent, to August Galileo, my beautiful son who lifts every day. And I've also been writing poems, and I've been teaching, both teaching poetry workshops and theory courses. So I've been all right. I've been very busy, and I've been, and I'll stop here. Like, I've been still for the first time since I was maybe 13 years old. Like I went to high school about 2 hours away from where I lived. And then I went to college 2 hours away from New York. And then I lived in England for a year. And then I went to grad school 2 hours away from where I lived. And now, I'm a professor at Dartmouth, but I live in Massachusetts. So I'm about 2 hours away from, from where I work. And so the pandemic just forced me to sort of be still. And also, I'm a touring poet and have been since I was 19, 20 years old. So this was also my first year since, college that I wasn't on the road. And I had to figure out what to do with myself, not, being out and about at colleges, universities, middle schools, high schools. So I'm all right, like I said in the beginning, but I'm learning and growing and changing in ways I never could have expected.
Oh my gosh, Joshua, you said so much about, there's so much to unpack with that, right? Of, bringing up this clear and present state in which we're in, which is the pandemic, and there's grief that's coming from that, the grieving of things that we wouldn't know we grieve, right? Like not being able to be in the room with Pam for ultrasounds, like that's a grief we sort of have to understand. But then also during the pandemic, the murders of Black individuals, the murders of brown people, this violence that feels like it is just rising and rising simultaneously with the pandemic. So we think of the mourning happening for these very harsh and destructive and violent things, but there's also that mourning that's taking place for rethinking the world in which we live, the moving through that space in society. But then saying the stillness, that you haven't stopped doing anything. I mean, my goodness, you're still so busy, but you're rethinking it, and this idea of being still, and how much of, in some ways, that is also like an act of activism for us as artists to be still. Because I remember I started working in the fields when I was 8, and I've never not had a job. And I remember in summer 2020, for the first time when I was transitioning from one university to teach at UC, I had that moment of stillness, and it sort of freaked me out to begin with. And I had to realize how to embrace it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. For those of us who grew up raised by poor and working people, I think there was always, or at least for me and in my neighborhood in New York, you just had to hustle. You had to have a thing.
Yeah.
Right? And that thing maybe needed to make you money, but bare minimum, it was connected to your sense of like value in the public sphere. And it was connected to what you felt like you gave to people, So I'm thinking too about my first job, which was picking up trash at my private school, over the summer while and this is an ode. There's a poem about this, right? Where my peers are studying physics at local colleges and going on road trips. And I was painting our cafeteria, and helping the maintenance crew do electrical work and picking up garbage. And yeah, one, I think the balance between that and the labor of lyric is still astonishing to me, because my father was a mail handler. Like for him, work is you pick up a heavy bag of mail and you move it quite far. And you do that for 40 years, 10 hours a day, right? In the middle of the night. And the idea that this is my job, right? To craft the ideas into something material. I don't know that I feel the same guilt or strangeness maybe that I once wrestled with, in part because, my dad kind of gave me his blessing on it. Right? He's like, well, no, that's why I did that. So you could have choices. And if your choice was to become a poet, that's awesome. And I celebrate you in that. And in so many ways now, I think for my students, I almost want to separate the poet as a job, right? From thinking about what are the ways that poetry helps you cultivate your imagination every single day, no matter the professional endeavor you're engaged in at the time. Absolutely. Right? How do we actually think of poetry as something that keeps us sharp, that helps us cultivate wellness? And thirdly, and I think perhaps maybe even most importantly in this moment, helps us come together for social occasions. Right? I think I've also had to think a lot about what we use poetry for socially. We read poetry at weddings, at funerals, poems, at least in my family, when children are born, right? It's a kind of poetic occasion. And so I've been thinking a lot more about that in this moment that's sort of marked by alienation and distance. What are the ways that we can return to what Mark Nowak calls, social poetics, and really take that seriously in a new way now, since we so desperately need it in ways that are ever more visible.
And what I really admire is, this fluidity in your thought process about artist and educator as one. I mean, in one swoop, you're talking about the history of your father and your own work, and then you're talking about what you talk to your students about. And like for me, I feel that to the core too. I think of the ways that I have become, and how then I bring that into the classroom in the learning environment. So many times students don't, and when I first meet with them, they don't understand, especially undergraduates, what poetry is, or the power of poetry, or they think poetry were these words and these rhyming poems from dead white men, which like that canon, there is that canon, but a new canon is completely being written by contemporary poets, by poets of color, by queer and trans poets, by poets with disabilities. Like, we're writing a lineage now that will be looked at as the canon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that aligns with this imagination that you're talking about. Like, poetry isn't just about you create something. It's about being part of a larger conversation in which you lead a poetic existence that opens you, that makes you think.
Yeah.
Right? That like realigns the way that you experience the world. And we're gonna talk more about imagination, because I already love where this is going. Can you talk to me a little bit about then, like, your thoughts around when I say poetry is activism?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that? How do you see poetry's relationship to social change, specifically happening now in contemporary poetry?
That's a great question. So I might be a bit biased in this regard, and I'll just admit that outright. In part because, like, I'm a self-taught poet. Like, I have no formal training in creative writing. I took one creative writing class in college. It was my worst grade in the major. I was sort of told that the poems were terrible. And through spoken word, poetry slam, my relationship to the Black church, and then just reading a bunch of books. Like, I had to teach myself form. I teach myself, how to understand meter in a certain way, how to read publicly. And so for me, I was always in sort of these spaces where poetry was meant to activate you, right? But it wasn't the only way that you were supposed to understand your own relationship to the material world and to protracted political struggle, right? So I think being in those poetry slams and open mics in high school was really where I first learned the language of settler colonialism, right? Thinking about patriarchy, sexism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness. This language was somewhat circulated in the classroom, but it really came to me with a certain kind of force and power at poetry slams in West Philadelphia, as a college student. And then beyond that, once I got to graduate school, I was studying poetry for myself, not just as a part of my larger intellectual project, but because I was trying to, as Raymond Williams would put it, tradition is about selecting and reselecting ancestors, right? And I was trying to find out who my ancestors were. And that brought me to the work of people like June Jordan, for instance, right? And I think for June Jordan, the poetic act, right, of witnessing was critically important. But June was also actually doing work on the ground in real life. And so I think part of what that left me with, right, was the impression that I had to actually also get up and do things for people, right? I had to start to try to create programming. I mean, I think about her program, Voice of the Children, for instance, right, which was specifically geared toward Black and Puerto Rican children in East Harlem and eventually in Brooklyn. And, she had a whole pedagogy around that, right? She had rules for the adults that would come into the space, right, to not pass judgment on the children's poems. I mean, she really had a kind of fundamental human vision and a life philosophy around, who children are, what children represent, and what the ways that children are treated, maybe even especially in a place like the United States, says about us, right? And says about where we are historically and culturally. So all of that is also to say, I think growing up in those spaces, or rather growing up intellectually in a certain kind of philosophical relationship to those spaces, and then also having the first space I ever taught in be a prison, right? Because before I taught in the university classroom, I taught in prisons in Philadelphia, in the men's and women's facilities. And I think that to me radically transformed the way I thought about the stakes of teaching as such. And so I had to think about what poems were for. I had to think about what prison was. And I had to think about abolition as as sort of more than a set of phrases, right? Like I had to make a kind of set of abolitionist decisions in that moment for myself as an educator. And I had to think about what my work over the course of my life would have to say to the fact of people in cages, to the fact of child poverty, and to the fact of my ancestors who laid down their lives for the cause of educating young people and educating adults and elders too, right? Of saying that education was not just about getting a credential, right? But the idea was that you were cultivating an inner world that the dominant order could not touch nor take away. And so that's part of it for me, at least, the way I think about how poetry can uniquely intervene in that discourse and in that history.
I honor and admire so much you coming through spoken word, because spoken word for me, I am not a spoken word artist. However, that was sort of my gateway into it as well. I mean, in my MFA and form and tech class, I wrote on slam poetry as a form, and my professor gave me so much pushback.
Of course.
And I said, let me show you how it's a form. And then I actually got apologized to at the end when I turned the critical piece in, because it did show, I mean, that spoken word and slam, so many of us, and I think like so many of us as artists of color come through that route when we're not, indoctrinated into the educational systems. But I also love this idea that, activism isn't it isn't an either or. It for me, I feel that poetry does allow us, it's an art form that allows us to put art into the world that can reshape someone's thinking, even though we don't fully understand and we don't get to witness how that happens. But the being on the ground, being out in the community, building community, lifting each other up is a huge part of it as well. So it's not an and, it's really it's a both. It's a both. And I love that you're bringing this up, because I think that I'm seeing some students who are wanting to do the writing. They're wanting to have the art do everything. And it can't be everything when it comes to social change, because you have to understand the world and the ebbs and flows and what's going on in your communities. Like there has to be the connection of both. But I'm also going to then segue into this, again, bringing up imagination and also sort of limitlessness. I'm going to specifically talk about ode, about how much joy there is in ode. It was such a necessary book for me. Thank you. Thank you. It came out in 2020 in a moment where I needed this book. The complex consideration of the ode form juxtaposed against the word ode throughout the book, the ideation of what a human owes their existence, right? Ancestors, family, those who forged paths before us, the small, insignificant things, but then also what a human and a person is owed as a human being, as a people, as a culture, like is all found in this book in such a stunning way. I'm actually going to read a piece of it, if it's okay.
Yeah, of course. That is cool.
In the fourth poem, Reparation, which appears to be a poem for the Voice's mother, your mother, right? I mean, it feels very the private into public throughout this whole book in a very necessary way. And, it begins, so much has been said about Black men and their mothers. But the last 4 stanzas, I was born with a job. I will die with one. We live in a country with no language for what you are, and I persist for the sake of your glory. Every single time it gives me goosebumps to hear that. Gregory Pardlow said that this poem is ultimately looking to elaborate on aesthetics of repair. And as readers, we feel that attention, you know, what the dominant narrative, what white supremacy has told us is insignificant, right? That Black existence is insignificant, that brown existence is insignificant. And there's a tension in these poems that are beautiful and harsh and unnecessary thinking. So with all that long introduction, I'm curious to how you see social change manifesting in your own art and in your own creative processes.
Yeah. Well, one, thank you for that generous reading of the book. Treating the kind of work with that kind of care just means a great deal, and it's not common, you know. So that means a lot. I mean, it's a tremendous influence on my work, right? And I want to say too, and not to let anyone off the hook, but I just think the thing is we can all make our own contributions, right, to the work of changing the material world, right, and to changing the material circumstances of vulnerable people across the globe, right? Some people's contribution really is going to be in the poems. And I think that's okay, right? For all sorts of reasons, right? For reasons having to do with disability, reasons having to do with class, reasons even having to do with comfort or readiness or education, right? Like political education is key before you want to go anywhere and get up on a stage and like talk about people's sociological situation, right? There's stuff you got to read, there's pamphlets and books, and there's speeches you got to listen to, right? So I think for me, part of what I've been trying to figure out as well, just for myself, is where can I be most helpful? And in what ways, right? Is it donating to a cause? Is it writing a poem? Is it helping to create a public installation? Is it going into a public school and helping create or fund a reading series, right? And I think being imaginative about it, because we're talking about imagination, but also being flexible and capacious. You know, you have to, and I love that. I've learned this from my friends who are musicians and actors. You got to be willing to improvise.
Yeah.
Right. That's actually how we improve upon the present state of the world, is that every day provides, as my mother would say, its own troubles, right? But also its own joys and its own causes for celebration. And we are optimistic, not because it is, you know, easy or just makes us feel good, right? But as Baldwin says, you know, we're optimistic to protect the children from despair, right? And because we believe that we can create a world worth inheriting. And that if we don't believe that, then what are we doing? Exactly. We're sort of spinning our wheels, right? If you genuinely don't believe that things can be different, then it's not clear to me what your solidarity is worth. Yeah. So that's what I think about. And that's where I take my inspiration from in my writing is not just poets, because it's not just poets that appear in the poems, right? Like there's Malcolm. I mean, and you could argue that Malcolm X was a poet, and he certainly was a fan of poetry. I mean, he wrote this letter that was quite beautiful about sort of the relationship between the interior lives of human beings and poetry. And poetry is a kind of singular genre, right, through which we can explore and express what happens in our hearts and minds. Yeah. But I try to cast a pretty wide net. You know, there are philosophers in my stuff. My mom is there. Bobby Brown is there. And in part, what I'm really trying to honor is the Black vernacular tradition in which I grew up, right? Where, you know, you might hear a Black Baptist minister talk about Shakespeare on a given day and then make a reference to certain kinds of political commentary and then go into the ancient world, you know, and I wanted that kind of scope and scale to be present in the poetry in no small part because I knew I was in pursuit of that kind of power with the work. And that if the poems couldn't hit people that way, I don't know that I was trying to do it, you know. And I say this as seriously. I mean, I could have just done something else, you know, with my life. Like this is, as June would say, it's like your one life, right? Yeah. Like you have to, as Rilke would say, you have to change it, right? And you have to make choices. Sorry, that's my son's uncle. And so you have to make choices, I think, that a lot. Why is he calling me twice? Okay, yeah. He realized like Josh is probably in some kind of event and I'm gonna let him do his thing. But you have to make choices. And I guess in the spirit, okay, I hope this is not an emergency and I'm just
I hope not either.
Yeah. I think something's going on with his phone. Hold on, so just give me 1 second.
No problem. No, my sister will repeatedly call me over and over and over again, and then I'll pick up thinking it's an emergency, and she'll be like, "What do you think of this shirt?"
I have to check in with you. And so, there are things happening right now. All right, I'm signed out, and I feel like he's probably fine. In any case, so.
but at the same time, I'm all for it. Like, I'm all for what this virtual world has sort of also exposed, like
Right.
the themes that have been exposed in our daily existence. And I feel like our humanity is even more present now. And that's kind
Yes.
of a beautiful thing.
No, I agree. I agree. Because I feel like the stakes of life and death itself are right in front of us now every day in a certain way. And
Yeah.
so I appreciate the grace too, that I can just text him and be like, are you good? In the midst of this recorded event, because that's just what real life actually is. I mean, I had a keynote recently that ended in part because my son was just crying. And
Yeah.
then I just stopped the Q&A. I was like, well, I have to go. Like real life beckons outside of the door of this event that we've created together. And we've been here 2 hours anyway, in front of our computers. So we're gonna
Exactly.
take care of him now. So.
One of the first times I ever heard you speak publicly, it was at an AWP. It was years ago. I think you were speaking on a panel with Martina Spada.
Oh
And
yeah, I remember this.
yeah, and you had said either you're doing the work of making the world a better place or you're doing something else.
Mm.
And I wrote that shit down. And I actually look at that often and talk to my students about that. And I ask them and I ask myself, am I doing something else? And that something else is extremely frightening to me because I want to be making the world a better place.
Yes.
And I feel that in your art. I
Mm.
feel how you show the multifaceted dimensions of our humanity.
Sure.
And as an artist of color, like we are not just our traumas, right? Like that's why Ode is so gorgeous because it is about celebration.
Mm.
And I think there's been this span of publishing where yes, trauma is very much rooted in the lives of people of color, but there's so much more. And that so much more is what you're speaking of in your work. And it's there and it's vibrant and it's from philosophy to music, to family, to ancestry. Like it's all in there together. And that togetherness is just unbelievably necessary for me. Um, what do you think it means to be a poet in the contemporary climate of this nation right now?
Mm.
Do we have obligations?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, we definitely have obligations. That's been my sense for a bit, though. I mean, look, I just think you have to tell the truth, and I mean this in a number of different ways. I mean, I think we actually do need to be wedded to certain empirical truths about the world as best as we can understand them. Because I think one of the poet's jobs is to bear witness. Yeah. To bear witness, though, not just to calamity, right?
Mm.
But to astonishing beauty and to do our best to render it in language, right? Like I think a lot about sort of Martha Nussbaum's writing on the way Henry James used to talk about the ancient role of the poet, right? Not poetry just as a genre, but the poet as one who has an encounter with the divine and needs to sort of render it, right, in writing. And I do feel like we're obligated to do that, right? Which is part of why I really struggle with the idea that all I'm supposed to be doing ostensibly as a Black writer is talking about how hard it is to be Black or something. And I actually quite troubled by that, it seems to me, because I think too now that's become a certain kind of business,
Yeah.
right? That all sorts of especially young Black writers are being asked over and over again to just talk about the sort of saddest thing they can imagine as it pertains to sort of Black life and Black death, and then just to put that out into the public sphere as some kind of holistic representation of our history and culture and contemporary being, even to the extent that when my son was born, I mean, the kind of narratives people have around like Black children, I'll say Black boys in particular, I mean, just genuinely take me aback. It's like, oh, are you worried? I'm like, I'm over the moon.
Yeah.
Just had a baby. I'm super stoked about it, right? And of course, like I read books and I've been alive as a Black man for a very long time. I understand all the reasons that I would have to ostensibly be afraid, but I don't feel that all the time. And I certainly don't feel that now. And I definitely would not like, just on a polite human level, for you to bring that to my door. Right? In this moment, I'm going to sit with the singular human gift of this new life that has been granted to me. right? This incredibly vulnerable, irreducibly wonderful, small human being that I now get the chance to grow alongside and teach and learn from. What could that be but sort of astonishing and wonderful, right? In a certain vein. And I think it just occurred to me that I had a certain obligation and political and social responsibility to render that in the poems.
Yeah.
Right? And to also, and I'll say this, you know, in no small part because, you know, I have a copy of the book too. Like that's my actual father. Yeah. On the front, like my mother took this picture in 1992. Those are real human beings. And I have obligations to them to tell the truth about my life and about the sacrifices that they made. So I'm not just walking around talking about how sad Blackness is, right? That's just not how I was raised. And I was raised by people who were the descendants of enslaved people. My grandmother was a sharecropper. That's where she met my grandfather in a strawberry field. And then they came to New York together, right? My father, as you see in the poems, right, integrated his high school, was getting stabbed on the way to English class, you know, all the time with pens by people he couldn't even see in the hallway, like true everyday institutional terror. And he made us eggs every morning. You know, he bathed us. And, you know, we talked about running and we talked about Richard Wright. And he raised me to really appreciate beauty. And he raised me to take mercy seriously. Because that's what my father really cared about, right? Mercy and forgiveness. And the fact that we all needed it. He even clarified that he needed it from us. You know, as we got older, he was like, I need you guys to forgive me for my shortcomings because you're all I care about, which used to make me sad. But now as a father, I get it.
Yeah.
You know? So anyway, all that to say, yeah, we definitely have obligations. We have obligations to the people we love. We have obligations to the future, right? To people who are not here yet, and people who are not asked to be here but are. We have obligations to the earth. And yeah, we have obligations to one another, right? To improve the thing, to beautify it. If this is a vocation for you, right? Yeah. Like if poetry is the calling, then that's what you're obligated to do and to take up.
I have been finding that this question is one that is really exciting for me to hear answers from. Because largely the wave is yes, yes, yes. And here are my thoughts on it. And for me, it is so heart swelling to hear about these obligations because I think that is why for me, the art form of poetry feels in such consideration with social change, because those of us who are using it as an art form are wielding it and understanding that it has power, and we can't write it lightly. We can't create it. We can't create lightly in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And in that creation, then thinking about imagination, which feels like, you know, tell the truth. You know, you're in one respect, we need to tell the truth. But then what role is imagination coming into play in poetry, but specifically in the invention, in the radicalization of spaces and a world where BIPOC individuals have full liberty and freedoms?
Yeah.
Where do you see imagination playing?
I mean, it plays a central role, right? For me. So even thinking about a poem like the Book of Micah, yeah, which from one vantage, someone would say it's just a poem about a boy who gets shot at a block party, right? But he comes back from the dead at the end of that poem. So for me, that critical reversal, right? And I only signal that with two words, right? He rose at the end. So it's like, what do you mean he rose? I can, from my vantage as a poet, I'm trying to say that within the world of that poem, that boy actually rose from the dead.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what you're to make of that, it's up to you, right? But to me, imagining another way that it could have gone, right? That to me is an important intervention, right? To actually say, well, how do we think about imagining alternate worlds within our world to tell a certain kind of social truth, right? I have a poem in my first book, The Sobbing School, it's like this too, called In Defense of Passing, right? Which is about the invention of this like holographic technology so that people can racially pass, right? I mean, that's a way for me to talk about colorism, but also state violence, right? Because what happens at the end of that poem is that poor people get access to that technology and the police sort of go through the slums was beating them up, right? And saying, look, color has a certain material purchase in the world. So you cannot use holograms to pretend to be, you know, a white or lighter skinned person. That for me is, you know, that's part of the kind of theoretical work I'm trying to do in the poems as well. And even though those are speculative poems, right, that take place in speculative or sci-fi worlds, that's still a kind of truth I'm trying to tell. Exactly. So we have room to imagine and to dream. I'm mostly just interested in toward what end do we employ our dreams? Because you can dream up and imagine all kinds of stuff, right? Pretending that our enemies don't have imagination is a real problem. Actually, I think underestimation is, it works against us, right? Those of us who love freedom and desire its proliferation, right? Presuming that people who hate freedom are unimaginative. I mean, history tells us otherwise, you know, as does the present day in terms of seeing what we're up against.
Well, and Claudia Rankine in Citizen writes, because white men cannot police their imaginations,
yeah,
Black people are dying.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. Like this idea that imagination isn't a core of humanity, and white supremacy has a full imagination and has been putting it to work.
Yeah.
And there are ways that our imagination, people of color, trans queer individuals, people with disabilities, you know, we have to speculate a type of truth that we feel and know needs to exist beyond that which is just given around us. Yeah. Because too often the truth around us, what is truth? It wasn't built for us. It was built with the idea of our death. And that's not a truth at all, is it? I mean, in reality. So you talk about the speculative poems, but I think for me, you know, I'm reading Alexis Pauline Gumb's book, M Archive right now, and loving it. Oh my gosh, I'm just loving it in so many ways. And one would say that's also, you know, is deeply rooted in feminism and Black feminism, and also, you know, speculative poetry. But the work that it's doing in the creation of ideations of worlds, of existences that can help us think through to where we need to be. Yeah, I think as a humanity and as a society. Okay, I know I'm already running out of time because this conversation is so amazing. I want to ask, kind of combined all the questions here, the last couple of questions are, what are your thoughts around the evolution of contemporary poetry that you're seeing now? You know, what is the landscape transforming? How do you maybe see it transforming? But then also, what makes you hopeful in poetry as an art form?
Yeah. How good it is. I mean, I just read a lot of really good poems from my peers, people like Taylor Johnson and Solmaz Sharif and Zandria Phillips and Marwa Halal and Levin Osman and Ricky Laurentis. Yeah. I mean, I just see really beautiful writing every day. Greg Parlow, Terrence Hayes, Camille Dungy. I mean, I read people's stuff. I'm like, oh, this is really good. Yeah. And takes up an incredibly wide spectrum of concerns, right? And is an everyday reminder that this is an ancient art that we've taken up in no small part because we need a better origin story, right? Like we need to tell ourselves stories as human beings to organize our social and political lives, I think, but also because a story creates a site of gathering and enjoyment and reckoning. Yeah. So I'm excited about contemporary American poetry. As always, we need to be sort of like wary and thoughtful about the market forces, like we've said earlier, that might propel us to a particular set of subjects, right? And a particularly narrow or myopic vision of our own political potential and the forms of social life that we can create together, right? We always want to be sort of wary and thoughtful about that. But at the same time, I see people building. I see people building institutions. And what I hope I continue to see are people turning towards certain kinds of archival work to resuscitate poets or the rather resuscitate the work of poets that we've forgotten largely, right? So, you know, I've really appreciated Terrence Hayes' recent work on this front around like Wanda Coleman and then Christopher Gilbert, right? I'd never heard of Christopher Gilbert. And
Yeah.
now he's one of the most important poets to me and to my work. In part because, you know, Terrence decided to write about that work publicly in a useful way. And I know Wanda Coleman was one of his great teachers, but she's also one of our great, you know, poets and stylists, and, you know, invented the American sonnet. I mean, that's important. You know, those are kind of historical innovations that we need to be thinking about. So I've been thinking more too about poets as cultural workers, and as people who need to recover histories of writing so that we remember not just how it was, you know, but how it felt.
Yeah.
And so we can create a kind of ongoing archive of how we're feeling and thinking as a species. I think that can be part of the calling of poets as well.
Well, and isn't that, I mean, creative writing is this gathering on the page over time and space, like almost a gathering and a building of community, whether we're looking forward or looking backward. And how, you know, how we think of who came before us. I mean, in all reality, thinking about Ode, you know, this archival work that you see being done, which is, I mean, which is absolutely fascinating. It's part of that, being a part of both an ancestral lineage as well as a future lineage, and where we're at now, you know, stuck in this perpetual present. It's all about that connectivity. It's all about how we are sharing over time and space this one moment, this moment and this moment and this moment, and rethinking about what was owed to those who helped us get here and what is owed into the future.
Sure.
of where we need to go.
Yeah.
I just love that idea.
Thank you.
But Joshua, thank you so much for your thoughts, your words, your art, this conversation, sharing space virtually today. For those of you who are listening, look for future discussions with poets, including Jennifer S. Chang, Vanessa Angelica Villarreal, as we continue to explore the art form of poetry as a catalyst for social change. Thank you all for watching, and thank you, Joshua.
Thank you, Felicia. Thank you all.